Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Yulia Panfil, and I'm the Director of the Future of Land and Housing Program at New America. I'm so pleased to welcome you to a really important conversation today. New America fellow Jake Biddle has written that the United States is on the precipice of the largest migration in our country's history. Extreme heat, sea level rise, and natural disasters like hurricanes and wildfires will displace millions of Americans from the Sun Belt and coastal areas over the next 50 years. The predictions vary, anywhere between 15 and 50 million. And while the exodus is all but certain, where these people land and how these moves unfold is very much still to be told. This massive population movement will have major economic, social, and political consequences. This is true both for the places being abandoned, what our first panelist, Van Newkirk, called dead zones, and for the places where people will move to, what our second panelist, Jesse Keenan, calls receiving zones. The decisions these communities make today will determine how they fare in the coming decades. Our program at New America is already working with several prospective receiving communities across the Great Lakes region to think through the housing stock they need in order to welcome and benefit from population inflows without displacing existing residents. So today, we are incredibly privileged to be joined by two of the leading thinkers on this crucial topic. Jesse Keenan is an associate professor of sustainable real estate and urban planning, director of the Center of Climate Change and Urbanism, and director of the Climate Change Science and Practice Minor Program at Tulane University. Jesse is one of the nation's leading scholars on climate migration, and he has just published a book called North, The Future of Post-Climate America, which focuses on the ways in which this domestic climate migration will transform everything from the physical landscape of cities to electoral politics. We'll be talking a bit about Jesse's book today. Van Newkirk is a senior editor at The Atlantic, the host of the podcasts Floodlines and Holy Week, and a New America Fellow. Van's writing focuses on the impacts of climate change on our country's most vulnerable and historically marginalized communities. His most recent piece for The Atlantic, What Climate Change Will Do to America by Mid-Century, argues that climate change will create physical and economic dead zones across the country, and Van examines what the impacts of that will be on the people who live there. So we're so privileged to have Van and Jesse in conversation about their work and about the future of climate migration in America. Van and Jesse will talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for robust audience Q&A. So I would encourage you as you listen to please drop your questions into the Slido box, and we will be collating them, and Van and Jesse will be able to answer your questions in the last 15 to 20 minutes of today's program. And so with that, I am so pleased to welcome Van and Jesse.
Well, thank you, Yulia, and thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Jesse, for spending this time this afternoon with me and with all the folks who are viewing. Like Yulia said, and like that gentleman with the beautiful voice at the beginning said, as we go, just drop your questions in the chat so we can have them. You don't have to wait till the end. Jesse. You've just published a book. I think we should start. Why don't you just tell us about that book?
Well, thank you, Van, and thank you, New America, for having me and everyone for attending today. It's a great privilege to join you all. Yes, North, the future of post-climate America. There's a couple of ambitions that I had with this book and a couple of stories that I wanted to tell. On one level, I wanted to address a scholarly audience in adaptation science, what it is and how it is that we adapt as a household, as firms, sectors, the economy, institutions, local governments. How are we adapting? How do we describe that? What are the decisions that need to be made? How do we move beyond the political rhetoric to understand the conflicts, the trade-offs, and the advance of human environmental welfare? We've had generations of people who've been working in renewable energy and sustainability and the like, but we're really the first generation to work and report on adaptation. and adaptation science, as we call it, as a broader interdisciplinary field. So I wanted to tell that story and lay out that landscape of where we are today in America and how that shapes where we're going. I don't really intend to project change or estimate it. I tend to highlight the mechanisms of change so we can understand where we're going. The other component of what I wanted to tell is at a household level, an individual level, how does that shape human mobility? And in this case, human mobility is a proxy for a whole slew of adaptations in the context of consumers, property taxes, housing, rent, insurance, the things that define economic populism today. How is that shaped by climate change, and how do we respond to that in institutional terms, but really at a household level? And sometimes that means moving from one side of the town to the other, and sometimes that means a broader migration or domestic migration in this context. I should qualify, I'm actually not a scholar in climate migration, although some people attribute that to my work. My core area is adaptation in the built environment and the urban planning, broader field of this. But between those two, a kind of scholarly ambition and a general audience ambition, there's a number of things that I wanted to get across. And the big, let's say, takeaway is that we tend to think through democratic processes that we're going to determine how and where we're going to go, who to protect, who gets left behind, right? We make those decisions about who are the marginalized communities that we want to protect, or who are the wealthy communities that we want to protect, or economies. And then who are we going to leave behind in this process? We think democracy and democratic institutions are going to guide us there. But what I show is that those institutions are falling behind, and it's really the market economy that's driving us forward. In a normative sense, the other story I wanted to tell in this book is that we have an opportunity wherever people end up, from just moving from one side of the town to the other, or again, moving across from one side of the continent to the other. We have an opportunity to invest in sustainability, invest in sustainable urbanism, and actually invest in ways that decarbonize and de-risk our built environment, our society, that aligns with a lot of other co-benefits that we seek, or public policy goals that we have to advance, again, social and environmental welfare. And so I try to balance, these are the challenges that we have, but really also these are the opportunities. And in that context, I set out a landscape, or an emerging landscape, of risk and opportunity.
So when I first talked to you, it was for the story that I was writing that Yulia mentioned, and I think we mostly talked about sort of the insurance and real
hmm
estate part of this. Can you
hmm
tell me just tell us about that mechanism?
Yeah, and in many ways, this is where my own story begins. As a scholar 20 years ago, I started taking on the study of real estate and housing and financial services in the context of climate change. There was a single published peer-reviewed journal article out at the time, and it was how you construct housing slightly differently because of heat and pouring concrete differently and things. People said I was totally crazy. It was a long-term phenomenon, that if at all, climate would, we're such a big country, the climate really wouldn't shape how and where we live. So in many ways, this is the book I wanted to write, was how climate change is already shaping how and where we live. And today, in the context of housing, rents, property taxes, utility payments, you name it, all the way up to the municipal bond market and global flows of financial capital, we see risk pricing. We see what we call risk capitalization, the internalization of the value of assets. It's not complete. We can't rely on price signal theory to fully manifest or change consumer behavior. But what we see is the inner workings through this book. What we see is the inner workings of the financial economy trying to take information. In fact, through the climate intelligence arms race, as I denoted, take that information in a race to profit from climate change. And sometimes that means profiting off of consumers who have less or imperfect, or sometimes even experimental incorrect data that's sold to them in the context of climate change. So what we see is the economy, and the economy is adapting, right? And we can talk about that in mortgages. We can talk about that in people who are paying higher rents. However you want to think about it, the economy is adapting, and it's adapting, in fact, much faster than our local and state institutions can keep up with.
Yeah, I think I was looking at the news on the Zillow, right? Zillow had to remove
hmm
their First
hmm
Street climate risk
hmm
indicator. Was it just in one state or was it overall?
Well, I think they didn't have to remove it. I think they made
Okay.
the election to remove some climate information from a particular provider on their website. There are others like Redfin, even a story out today. You can see my commentary in the Washington Post on this to this effect, that are, keeping climate information as part of the consumer interface for shopping. What's interesting actually about what that story in the Washington Post today is that what Redfin, again, the entity that kept that data, they started to show a seasonality pattern. In that sense, people aren't just looking at climate risk information after an event, which is quite common. We've known that. We've seen even economic responses in the short term from events. But there's now a season. There's a climate season. We all know the climate season. We're super busy from June 1st to the end of October. But now we see that climate season in the patterns, or at least the shopping patterns of consumers. And man, that brings up a great point because it's really at the end of the day, we can talk about Wall Street and everything, but at the end of the day, and I talk about this extensively in the book, it's buyers and sellers. It's small time, multifamily apartment owners, but it's just everyday people who are buying and selling property and looking at the forward, what they expect that forward value to be. Right. And of course, the other consideration is, well, how much is it going to cost me with increased insurance, increased property taxes? The current carrying costs are a drain. And I think we can appreciate that. But what we more fundamentally see is that people are looking into the future about the relative, let's say, decline or depreciation of these assets. And that's a much, much bigger shift in consumer preferences and in our economy. It's the demand function that's changing.
I want to remind everybody to drop their questions in the Slido chat. You have any questions for me, Jesse?
No, Jeff, Van, thank you so much. Let's turn this over to you and your reporting. I'll get off the hot seat for a second, and thank you for joining us. I set up in the book a kind of geography of risk and opportunity. I define this as somewhat clinical terms as sending zones and receiving zones. Your work, or at least your recent work, has focused in on, let's say, the sending zones, or as you label it, the dead zones. And we talk a lot about human mobility, and I think you talk about human mobility, but the flip side of that is immobility, right? And from your point of view, um, when you're engaging with people and in your reporting, what's keeping people in place, right? Because we could think that, oh, there's a kind of rational economic motivation, higher wages, lower costs. That's some component for some people, but there's also an affective aspect, right? And I talk about Amitav Ghosh and others who've really written about this and taken on among many things, the attachment to place and the complexities of making decisions with families. So in your mind and in your reporting, what's shaping immobility? What's keeping people in these places that seem almost to have a somewhat terminal future?
Well, I think you look at the places, our geography of risk in America, it overlaps with a lot of different historical geographies as well.
Hmm. Hmm.
So you look at a place like the Deep South, which is where we're going to see, but we are seeing lots of effects from heat, from sea level rise, from riverine and other flooding. Those are also places where people have high degrees of rootedness, where you have some of the last truly multi-generational
Hmm.
family communities, where you have a lot of folks in smaller towns and medium-sized towns whose family has been in that town for a long time. And out west, you have a lot of folks for whom that move west was their big family, it's part of the family story.
Hmm.
Is we moved out here for a better chance, for a better life, and we're not moving. And so you have a lot of folks who actually are they're involved in both terminals of that story. You have folks who moved during the Great Migration of African Americans, and a lot of those folks who moved in the tail end of that migration, they're elderly, they're still around, and
Hmm.
they're the folks who are homeowners in California, who were pushed out to suburbs that were not redlined, for example. And a lot of them have families who are back in Mississippi and Louisiana, but also in those places like New Orleans and Miami. You have families who, regardless of race, are they are attached in a real way to the story, to the local economy, and you see patterns emerge with who is able and who is willing and to move. And those two things are not always as separate as we like them
Hmm.
to be. So say you have a business owner in Miami. Say you have a guy who runs a cafe in Miami. It is, that's a family story. That is a part of that history that is important to them. But also, it is just mechanically difficult to move somewhere when your income comes from a small business, for example.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so we see these bands of people who are more likely to move and who are less likely to move. They're not always correlated directly with income the way you might expect. Sometimes it's the poorest people and some people who are relatively well off, including those small business owners who are most likely to stay. And then you have people who are maybe working class, who have less local attachment and more portable skills, who are able and willing to move. And often the people who are very wealthy, who already have maybe dipped a toe into digital nomad life, who are more likely and less rooted and move. And so, what I tried to do in my story was to take a look at what happens to those folks who, again, we don't want to separate out too much the willingness and the ability, but for whom, by whatever reason, they are not likely to be moving uh, or moving very far as well because of climate change.
Yeah, I'm curious in your terminology of dead zones and how you frame that and position that. I set up a kind of clinically neutral idea of sending zones and receiving zones, acknowledging there's a lot of gray area in between. In fact, many people live in two places at the same time. We see that with tribal communities where they've got a foot in both places. It's part of a broader transition, just a practical and logistical transition. I'm curious in your reporting, your on the ground reporting, have you seen the sort of backfill, right? You have one component of a community they're on the move. They have that mobility, they have the capability and desire, as you say. But then they're replaced by another component of a community, an immigrant community, for instance, or a lower income community who's taking advantage of lower rents or whatever that may be. And that itself has a kind of morphology to it urbanistically. Is and in fact, there may be a lot of good things about that, not just a function of displacement and the costs that come along with it. I'm curious if you've seen that kind of structural change or the change of the identity of these places by virtue of actually newcomers coming in behind them.
Well, that's the story of America, right?
Yeah.
People move to the places where people once were, and communities have this constantly renewing cycle of identity and of belonging. But I think, and this is still happening in many sending zones, in many places where people are beginning to leave. You are seeing like you said, there's cheaper real estate, there cheaper rents. People can move in. You're seeing a place like Miami, for example, which has net negative, um, you know, domestic movement into Miami is still sustained by
Hmm.
its population is still growing because of immigration. So that's still happening. But what I was focusing on, and this is not all sending zones, it's a subset of sending zones where something in the machinery is breaking to
Hmm.
where you're going to be less likely to have that happen. So
Hmm.
where your home or your real estate or your insurance markets are not going to be able to support the same amount of people as they could before, where rents and prices are still increasing, often by way of insurance premiums. Essentially places that are on a type of downward spiral economically, where they're contracting. And then these type of spirals kind of resemble uh, what we used to think about and write about when we talked about the Rust Belt, for example.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's I think the distinction I'd make is the dead zones are places where you can see the beginnings of this spiral.
Yeah, and I take that
Yeah.
on on in the book, and what I call, or I appropriate, I should say, is the climate doom loop.
Right.
And I'm looking at that in the context of principally not so much social relationships or sort of demand side of it, but really local governments and municipal finance and the decline in amenities, the decline of services, the increase in taxes, and the extent to which that becomes a reinforcing cycle that reduces the desire for people and businesses to be retained and to even move there in the first place. And I understand.
Yeah, that was
But,
one of my favorite points of yours in the
mhm,
book. I think we think of towns and cities often, not we, I
mhm,
think lots of folks think of towns and cities as these things that are just sort of there,
mhm.
right? These governments that just exist on the same level and permanence as states, but they're corporations, they're businesses,
Yeah.
and they have to, pay for things. And the more you increase climate risk, the more they have to pay for that, right? And then, as you were describing, and maybe you should tell us more about it, like once you have that climate doom loop start, these corporations are not equipped for that.
Yeah, and I think that they are not equipped, particularly in terms of our style of governance and our historical construction of governance, right? And I'll give you an example of this. All throughout New England, really all throughout the East Coast, but particularly the Northeast, we have small hamlets within towns, within larger townships that are in counties. We have a very, very fragmented governance structure that and utility structure that is an artifice of the 18th and 17th century in terms of population, democracy, self-governance, and the like. And here we are today with enormous, well, and a misalignment of political and environmental geography, right? And that misalignment means that our opportunities for scale deployment of infrastructure finance or investment, just investment in affordable housing to transition some portion of a population or even a wastewater treatment plant that, by the way, most of them are sited in sea level rise flood zones, simple things like that. These small governments just don't have the capacity. And I was just up in Cape Ann in Massachusetts recently, and you've got Manchester by the Sea, you've got Gloucester, you've got Essex, you've got all these little townships that really just exist as a function of history. And there's a tremendous opportunity to work together in terms of regional government. And there's a call there in Massachusetts, for instance, to start thinking and actually delegating power and authority back to the county. For instance, in Florida, Florida doesn't get a lot of things right, but in Florida, they benefit greatly, for instance, from these very large counties that actually help take on these tasks at a regional scale. So, in many places in America, this misalignment between environmental and political geography, I think necessitates, if we're thinking about climate planning and making investments in either sending zones or receiving zones or however we want to manage this transition and transformation ultimately in the advance of people's lives, we have to really fundamentally think these modes of governance because there's lots of little utilities out there that are essentially underwater. Financially and increasingly physically, and that they have more liabilities than more debt than they have income and revenue, and we're starting to see this structural erosion, and that becomes a stress that, by the way, transmits throughout the economy and throughout a broader, for larger towns have to take on those assets, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a fundamental challenge to how we govern ourselves, and whether that's going to be through increased, as I argue in the book, increased stress in the municipal bond market and delinquencies, and ultimately what I foresee is a fair amount of bankruptcies. And by the way, the bankruptcy code in the United States is not oriented towards liquidation, it's oriented towards reorganization. But what we're going to see is the necessity to frankly liquidate assets and take under receivership, that is state receivership, taking oversight over local governments and local problems and challenges. And that's going to be a huge burden for states across the country.
And the municipal bond market is not prepared for this type of offloading.
No, interestingly enough, I would say that they are probably not prepared for what we see, particularly in the age of austerity that we are approaching now. Something like 20% of local revenue comes from the federal government or state transfers. That was essentially a compromise that came with tax caps in the 1980s and 1990s. Yes, we'll cap your taxes, but we're going to shift that revenue to the federal government. And of course, that's been waning, and now it's been largely cut off. And we're going to see in the next really matter of months and certainly years, the convergence of a political economy of austerity and climate coming together to fundamentally put significant stress. But is the bond market prepared? What I highlight in the book is yes and no. There is a risk premium that the bond market is placing on bonds in high risk areas. And by the way, the longer you borrow the money, the greater the premium. The good news is that they seem to be offering a bit of a benefit for those that are doing the planning, doing the engagement in terms of policy and investment on adaptation and risk mitigation. So the bond market's beginning to reward those that are engaged in this, but ultimately it's a penalty. It's a risk penalty. And I did a small calculation not that long ago when I was speaking in Atlanta. And just extreme heat alone, believe it or not, is calculated in the bond issuance of the city of Atlanta. The heat dimensions this, which by the way, it's a super hot day. People don't go retail, they don't shop retail, lower retail taxes, sales taxes, et cetera, et cetera. There's real implications here. It adds just heat alone today adds like something like 5 or 6% of your bond costs, which is not, sounds small, but these are large numbers in the aggregate when you consider how much capital is being rolled over. So you start thinking about these little stresses, right? It's not just insurance, but that's a part of it. And you start thinking about bonds and property taxes and sales taxes and revenue. And by the way, in an era where FEMA is no longer around or as effective in their deployment of federal dollars after a disaster, we're looking at significant municipal financial distress. And in fact, there's a fair amount of good research out there that looks, or at least some good research that has modeled what happens to the bond market when you take FEMA post-disaster dollars out of the equation. And it's not good.
Hmm.
It's not good. We're looking at many communities, particularly in the Gulf Coast, who face bankruptcy. And that is, we're talking about letting go teachers, right? Closing down health clinics. Basic services here are on the brink. And really that threshold it's not going to be much that tips people into the threshold of the climate doom loop and into dead zones.
I think we're hearing about that, word about that here in Maryland too.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So Van, if I could just turn back to you for a second. What's next for you in terms of you've got the reporting, you've built the relationships and a kind of voice. And what comes next in terms of following how these stories develop and finding some, I wouldn't say cross comparison, but finding some momentum in what unites these stories. What comes next for you in that regard?
Well, I think this is I consider it a beat. It's just I keep tabs on places that are currently being stressed in a number of ways.
Hmm.
Climate change being one of them, I think that coincides with a real crisis in the ability of some places to sustain themselves as independent, to have local governance, and now we're having a crisis of democracy in a lot of these places.
Yeah.
Um, I think part of what I'll always do, as long as I'm fortunate enough to call myself a journalist, is to go and canvass places like this, to go and speak to people who live in them. Because to me, that's the fulcrum of where change, for good or for ill, in this country and in this world, where it's being made. As far as concretely, I am working on, if my editor is on in the audience here, I'm almost done, with a manuscript called Children of the Flood. And it's more along these lines. It's about historically Black communities in the South that are facing destruction from climate change
Hmm.
and how people there are trying to leverage their histories, their really priceless and valuable histories, in saving the towns. The story has changed quite a bit in the past
Yeah.
year, but and that's I'm going back out to do the last round of reporting in the next few weeks.
One of the things I take on the book, just thinking about my own experience, 1994, Albany, Georgia, wiped off the map, massive flood. It had to have,
Albany, Georgia.
yeah, it had to have changed the way I view the world, just thinking about children of the flood. Um, yeah, I mean, one of the things I take on in the book is some of the inherent conflicts between climate justice and environmental justice, and the political communications and political rhetoric, particularly around climate justice. I'm curious, and I'm not making a judgment call here. I'm trying to evaluate the extent to which there are different modes of engaging people and communicating risk and opportunity as well. And certainly the Biden administration had a very strong argument with employment and a kind of green growth model. And that largely fell flat politically. But in communities, particularly in the South, I wonder where the climate justice line of thinking has resonated and where it maybe hasn't resonated. Because one of the main challenges, one of the things I outline in the book is listen, the federal government's done next to nothing on adaptation. In fact, the Biden administration made the mistake of conflating environmental justice and adaptation that created a lot of challenges along the way. But in the era, particularly of economic populism, and I think part of what I argue for in the book is that there's a new way of communicating about climate change that's maybe grounded and would resonate in these terms. But I'm curious, in the age of economic populism, particularly in the South, how does that messaging or how do those modes of communication change and adapt to what people are concerned about?
Well, that's the, I guess, trillion-dollar question in a lot of places. Well, I mean, I think one of the big things that you alluded to is this dialogue between, the very EJ-centric right to stay in place
Yeah,
and
right.
a climate realist need for managed retreat, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of places, I cover all three of the places that I cover in the book are towns that face significant challenges to their existence from flooding, and challenges that we likely won't, be able to infrastructure away. And so they are going to, whether, uh, whether it's by choice or not, people will move. People are moving.
Hmm. Hmm.
The difficulty there, though, the people understand in these communities. They know they are, I think, a lot of these poor rural communities that are facing the greatest climate risk have some of the most climate savvy citizens in the world.
Hmm.
They
Yeah.
understand what's happening
Right.
and they know that people will have to move.
Hmm.
Um, I think where you have the biggest disconnect is in honoring, sort of the importance of place and the importance of independence and choice
Hmm.
and giving people choices. Some people are not going to make the choice we want them to make. And I think that's
Hmm.
just how it's going to,
Right.
pan out. But as far as I've seen, where the federal government and state governments have gone out and said two places where we know in 50 years, you know, half of this town is going to be in the 100-year floodplain. We can't ensure that. We can't keep pouring FEMA money into rebuilding. And now, actually, in the Biden administration, we could not legally do that.
Hmm.
And
Right.
so, what are the conversations we're having with these folks to have them understand that and to give them choices? And I think, as you mentioned, with this wave of populism, I think there is opportunity in
Hmm.
this to give people to frame climate policy as choice,
Hmm.
to tailor our solutions less toward we're going to come in and tell you, the Army Corps is going to do this and that, and you're going to be moved here and there, versus, we are working for you. And how do we create economic incentives? How do we create new types of, everybody hates voucher programs, but
Yeah, I
they
got
are
you. I
voucher
got you.
programs.
You're integrating
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. How
Yeah.
do you integrate it into the local decision-making apparatus?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And I think choice is the key component of it. And the argument I make throughout the book is that we think we have the choices, but increasingly those options of what those choices may be are fundamentally being shaped by the market economy.
Yeah.
And if we take people's disdain at what they see as a kind of range of exploitations, challenges, accessibility, affordability, all of that wrapped into a series of actors and agents, um, it's a wall to it's a wall to push back on against, right? And in the name of choice, in the name of the political rhetoric of freedom, I'm not saying democratic institutions aren't up for the task and don't play a role. They are, and I argue for civic nationalism in the book. In fact, to that end, not ethno-nationalism, but civic nationalism, and but there's no doubt that, as I see it, this is part of a lineage of contemporary thinking that changes our political discourse and challenges where institutions have failed and how we need to reorganize. This is just the beginning of a broader notation of not just human mobility, but just how do we fundamentally transform in the face of climate change. And that transformation is broad scale.
Before we turn it over to the audience, I do want to ask you about one part of the book that is just exciting for anybody who hasn't read it, and you dabble a little bit in fiction in there. Tell us about that.
Van, I wanted to tell, well, I did write a chapter. The last chapter is a work of fiction. I always wanted to read science fiction that had, particularly climate science fiction, cli-fi as they call it, that had footnotes from the real science, because so much climate science fiction is drawn from real science, real social science, empirical observational science. And it's always difficult to kind of understand the boundaries between fiction and empirical science in that work. So why did no one ever write a science fiction chapter based on actual science, or at least that they were drawing from those lessons and that information and knowledge. And that was the challenge I set out for myself. And so in a way, the fiction chapter is a summary of what you read throughout the rest of the book. But it's in the context of not just institutions and economies and the certain scale of operations. And I tell stories of people and households along the way, but I wanted to ground this in the psychosocial dynamics, into the personal aspects, and of what it means to be on the move. And the preface of the entire book starts with my wife and I and our unborn child leaving New Orleans behind as our roof's getting blown off and having to move to another state to have a child, which, by the way, is not easy. I just want to say. Um, but in a way, what does it mean to step into these shoes? The future is, it's not good or bad, it's just different. And what does that future look like? And what are the mechanisms of change that I explored throughout the book? How do they land into a story that maybe people can connect with? And that was my ambition.
Hmm. Well, I loved it, and I really did appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Jesse and Van. I think that this is a great point to transition to some audience Q&A. We've got lots of questions from the audience, so I will throw a few your way. The first one, I'm reading the question. I know it's hard to estimate, but in what years approximately do you anticipate that we'll see a majority of this migration?
Van, can I take a quick stab at that?
You got it.
So one of the title of the book is a little confusing. because and so is the AI, the mischaracterization on AI on the internet as to what the book is about, or even what the science is about. But I don't think anyone in sociology, demography, etc., is projecting this large shift in the population or large. We're talking about millions of people, tens of millions of people over the course of decades. But we're a very large country. We're what, over 322 million people right now. So it's a small percentage of the whole. But the challenges and the opportunities that we speak of resonate in the fact that even a small amount of people moving somewhere, and we haven't really had the opportunity to talk about receiving zones and the opportunities vested in that, can fundamentally alter a school, a local community, right? Just small amounts of people. We've seen in Duluth, several thousand people move to Duluth and turn Duluth upside down in just a very short amount of time because it's only a city of 100,000. So I think when we're looking at this movement of people, it's a gradual movement from a lot of different areas in the north and in the south and in the east and the west. One of the biggest receiving zones in the country right now is Ocala, Florida, in the middle of the state. So it's you have to think in terms of this operating on the margins to other shifts in migration and population in the United States.
Yeah, one of the things that I say in that story is in America and especially in politics, small change is often deeply felt. And
Mm,
so yeah, I don't think we really know when, we are talking aggregate movements. They're not all regional movements. A lot of them are within town, within county, within region. Um, but I think it's less so that you're going to have a sort of wave than the ways that population shifts in America always change are also changing.
mhm.
Yeah, thank you. Next question is a pretty meaty one. Um, you both spoke about governance and sort of the governance and political implications of these population shifts. And the question is, how could we feasibly reconfigure the geography of governance to make it possible to manage climate impacts without resorting to authoritarianism?
Van, why don't you take this one first, Van?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the first thing is, as I mentioned in my answer, without significant federal support, which, as we now know, can wax and wane. The current municipal model of a lot of places of independent corporations that operate within a quasi-democratic structure, I don't know if it's going to cut it. I think we are going to have to look more to counties, which have often been forgotten as our local governing unit.
Hmm.
We're going to look more to the actual powers of counties and parishes, as outlined in state constitutions, as levers for defraying the costs of climate change and for doing some of the larger projects that we know we'll need to do. We need to build housing. We'll need to, as you said, Jesse, begin the process of relocating critical infrastructure. A lot of that's going to have to be taken on at the county level.
Hmm. Yeah, in addition to counties, and I think most of that opportunity and action will be at the county level, you're also looking at regional cooperation among counties, right? And there's great examples of this, the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change. In fact, see compacts between counties and cooperation in the Bay Area and California. All throughout the country, counties are cooperating, and states themselves can play a very important role. The states have all the authority, and as Van notes, it comes from state constitutions in delegated authority, and they have the ability to rewrite these jurisdictional boundaries as they see fit. It may not necessarily be politically convenient, but it may be economically necessary.
The next question focuses on prospective receiving zones. And the question is, for these receiving zones, what are the most important things that they need to be doing today to ensure that they can successfully absorb potential population inflows over the coming decades?
I feel like
Yeah,
that's a question for Yulia.
yeah. Yulia, maybe I'll try to channel your inspiration here. I think this is a somewhat counterintuitive answer. The challenge is to make investments in the quality of life for the people who are living there today. You have to build, a lot of communities, and in the book, I break down the mythology of climate havens and show that origins and the promises and perils, mostly perils of what that means rhetorically. But, a lot of communities who project that they are a receiving zone or that they have these amenities that try to draw people in, they get a lot of slack for it. And maybe they should, because maybe they're not actually planning. But what I think people don't appreciate is they're trying to build, the audience isn't an external one. The audience is an internal one. They're trying to show that there's a growth model here at play, and maybe even a green growth or sustainable opportunity to make investments in the current housing stock, the current transportation, the current school system, the current park zones. Now, I've had conversations with multiple city council members in the Midwest, and for them, it's a moment to take stock in the opportunity to make investments for people today because that will inure to the benefit of who comes next. Renovation of your housing stock, preservation of affordable housing, all of these things are to the benefit of today and tomorrow. So we have the tools, we know what we need to do. We have to build coalitions and we have to build a kind of resonance among cultural institutions and community institutions to be able to support that transition. And that's not easy to do, but some places that are better at that than others.
Anything to add from your side, Van?
Not much. I mean, I think the one thing that we should always keep an eye on is how to manage and think about this proactively politically. How do we absorb new folks into a local or state polity in a way that I think we've had some good models at places that have done this well. I think about Connecticut after Hurricane Maria, for example, became a really great receiving zone in many ways that was surprising to people for Puerto Ricans who were leaving after the storm. And there was a lot of challenges when you have that happen. You have to think about how much capacity you have in your local education system. You've got to think about how you handle things like language support and assistance. And so those are sort of the softer pieces of this uh, that local governments are really going to have to work to figure out.
And since you both invoked me at the beginning of this question, I'll take my moderator's privilege to just say, like 30 seconds worth of commentary on this question. Um, I think that there's a bit of a flywheel that happens where, people will leave is not necessarily in question, but where they land is very much up for grabs. And we know that people move for jobs, they move for, family and social ties, and they move to where they can find affordable and abundant housing options. And, the places that make those investments upfront, as Jesse pointed out, these are investments that regardless of if anybody shows up, they will benefit the people who live there anyway, are going to be the ones who will be the most appealing to people who are seeing the writing on the wall and trying to figure out where they're going to move to. And then as populations inflow into those areas and there's enough, housing infrastructure, transit to absorb them, then that's going to grow the tax base, that's going to attract businesses, that's going to provide the density for, new restaurants and bars and stores to pop up, which will bring more service jobs. And so it's a little bit of this, but you have to make those investments first as it's sort of a build it and they'll come. And, we've seen some cities starting to take that plunge.
Yeah, Yulia, I completely agree, and it reminds me of something that I think is really important, at least from drawing from the book. Or which is that we tend to think about relocation and migration. Again, a lot of this is just people moving from one side of town to the other. But we tend to think of this as people who are displaced in the push and pull of it all, right? And as I argue in the book, climate's just one of many factors that we give consideration to mobility decisions, right? It's on the table, it's weighted in different places by different people in different ways. But it's not just people who are displaced or on the push side of the equation, right? We have people who are stress-based sorters, right? We have people who are sorting into areas because they're making trade-offs between the cost of living and the risk of loss. We have people who are circumstantial opportunists who are, when presented with the information about the opportunities for future value or reduction of loss, they take it. They're not really thinking about climate in the moment. We have electively mobile people, and we even have preemptive value investors who are moving capital and investment, and they're thinking about the long-term deployment of that capital in the shift of people and firms and the economy across these geographies of risk and opportunity. So I think one of the challenges we have is we have this typecast, a kind of role of the displaced household, but that's actually a really small part of what we see in this broader adaptation in terms of human mobility.
So the next question is one of my favorites. It's a magic wand question. So if each of you had the ability to enact one policy to increase household mobility, household climate mobility, or to increase the availability of choices, what would that be?
Oh, Van, I've got a short one. Can I go quick?
Go ahead.
May I rather? Yeah, this is really easy. Return the tax deduction for moving expenses. In the 2017 Tax Act, I think it was, we took out the deduction for moving expenses for American households. A huge mistake. If we brought that back, it would help a good number of people.
Not to be too like galaxy brain about it, but the one policy I would have to make this to increase, household climate mobility and to I think it would just be to cap carbon emissions. Boom. Um, but I think closer to the ground, one thing that you raised again, Jesse, that it really stuck with me was this availability of information. And I think increasing the public availability of climate risk information for sellers and buyers, I think would be very useful in the years to come.
So,
And by the way, that's a super accessible policy, which, thanks to NRDC and a number of others, we have tons of disclosure laws now that have popped up in states all throughout the United States, and so we're heading in that direction, hopefully.
So we'll have two more questions from the audience and then we'll close. The next one, in your prior discussion just now, you briefly touched on incentives, and there's a further question about that. How do you convince people to move out of harm's way? What are the incentives that work?
Uh, so again, I think we need to understand that people who are in harm's way tend to be savvier than we expect, tend to understand realistically what the costs and benefits of movement and staying are. They have just made a different calculation than we would like them to make. And so, really, you have to provide whatever is on the side of the equation to make it make sense, to make it the answer that you want. And so, on the one hand, that might be more information. It may be, helping grease the wheels by making the process easier. Moving is hard. Moving across town is hard. And if you've lived in one place for your whole life, and maybe you're elderly, a lot of elderly folks, they tend to be the people who are the stickiest, who are the least likely to move, and you see this sort of like breakage point where the one opportunity you get to uh, have to undergo managed retreat in a lot of places is when they start to think about assisted living, right? So how do we assist that family with the options for how to deal with grandma's property she's had her whole life? Just things that make that transition easier, I think, would help a lot of this. We really underestimate how difficult moving is. And the other thing I have is this is even more tough in places where you have a lot of what's called heirs property. So if you have property that doesn't have a clear title, and it works this way in a lot of places in the South, and you have a bunch of family members who are entitled to make decisions, but who are not governed by any sort of will, um, it gets really messy really fast when you start talking about retreat or movement.
Yeah,
Uh,
Van, oh,
yeah,
sorry,
go
Van.
ahead. You got it.
No, I just want to riff on that because not what we see now with heirs property too is that it's hard to get insurance coverage and full insurance coverage if you don't have that vested title interest. And the example that you bring up in terms of aging society and elderly is entirely on point. Just the single challenge of moving medical records and moving doctors alone, not easy. And so moving medical licenses, moving all of the things that come along in terms of the institutional parameters that define how we move, not easy for the elderly. As I highlighted in the book, even moving the dead is not easy. There are networks now. Most of the cemeteries in this country are managed by networks. Those networks now sell you grave sites where you can move your deceased, your loved ones, from one flooded place to a non-flooded place is part of the package that you can buy. So it's a challenge for the living, and it's a challenge for the deceased.
So I'm going to sneak in this last question, just very brief responses, please. But the last question, what successful policies exist to safeguard Black and Brown communities who are at higher risk for climate impact or at higher risk for displacement from gentrification, presumably from people moving in to a new area?
Um, I think that's a major assumption that they do. No, I think I would say the successes I've seen have been where states and communities have gotten involved below the federal level and have done some of the things we just talked about. So, helping with rental assistance for movers, helping with the sort of transition elements. FEMA actually, before it was pared back, had some good programs that help with this. So I think just more and more of this greasing the wheels thing.
There's a lot of things local governments can do to prevent crowding out. As Van highlighted, it's not necessarily true that Black and Brown communities are at a higher risk, and sometimes they're at actually a lower risk, and that makes them a target for a different set of challenges like climate gentrification. But we have the tools in terms of land use zoning, planning, in terms of inclusionary zoning, for instance, and the provision of affordable housing. We have all the tools that we need for housing stability and promotion of housing quality and the preservation of affordable housing and the preservation of housing for middle income and across cohorts in America. We just have to have the willingness to use them and be motivated and have the political discourse to support that. So there's nothing tricky or new or novel here. We have the tools. We know what we need to do. We just need to be motivated to do it.
Well, that is a perfect ending point for a very, very wide-ranging discussion from municipal bonds to corporate cemetery networks and with climate adaptation running throughout. Thank you so much, Van and Jesse. It is such an honor to be in conversation with both of you and, well, really to host the two of you in conversation with one another. Please pick up Jesse's book, North, on sale wherever books are sold.
And
And
listen, climate change is tough right now. So for everybody out there listening, just shoot me an email. I'll send you a copy. I know it's a tough world we live in, so I just want people to read it. But thank you, Yulia.
Van, we will look out for your forthcoming book on this topic. Thank you all so much for tuning in and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Van. Thank you, Yulia.
Thank you. Y'all take